This woman was just humbled by a judge after stealing someone's house because she claimed she had squatters' rights after booking a month-long Airbnb stay in Washington, D.C. And nearly a year later, the woman effectively took over the house, living there rent-free while the actual homeowner was suffering financially and was locked out of the property. And the wildest part is, the legal system was essentially powerless to remove her thanks to a loophole in a tenant protection law that kicks in just after 30 days. So it's safe to say we have quite the wild story. So in February of 2025, a woman named Rashan Douglas, who owned a property in Northeast Washington, D.C., she was renting out her house on Airbnb, and she got a booking request from someone named Shadia Romero for 32 days, which seemed straightforward enough at the time. Shadia said that her apartment had caught fire and she needed temporary housing while the damage was being repaired. And for the first month, everything appeared to be running normally. Shadia was staying there, presumably paying for her stay through the platform, and Rashan probably figured this was just another routine booking. But when March 29th came around, that scheduled day end of the 32 reservation, things completely went off the rails because Shadia didn't just pack up and leave. Instead, she informed Rashan that she was claiming residency and had tenant rights to the property. And yeah, because she'd been there for more than 30 days, the law in Washington, D.C. backed her up on that claim. So just like that, Rashan went from being a short-term rental host to being stuck in a landlord-tenant situation that she never agreed to. That sounds insane to everyone who lives outside of probably Washington, D.C. and California. I feel like California, Washington, D.C., maybe New York City has something like this. But to understand all of this, unfortunately, we have to talk about how D.C. handles tenant protections. But basically, in Washington, D.C., if someone pays money to stay in your property for 30 days or more, the courts will treat them as a tenant with full legal protections, regardless of whether you actually signed a lease with them or not. And that's just crazy to me because it doesn't matter if they came from Airbnb or VRBO or any other short-term rental platform. It doesn't matter if you explicitly told them it was temporary. Once that 30-day mark hits and money has been exchanged, they're legally considered a tenant.
Would you say the laws in DC are favorable to squatters?
Well, they're favorable to tenants, and one person's squatter is another person's alleged squatter, an actual tenant. And the court is going to make sure that it finds out the answer to that preliminary question of has that individual achieved tenancy status or not. And so you're starting with the conclusion that the person's a tenant, but that individual has a right to go to court and try to prove that she's actually a tenant and afforded all of the rights of tenants in the district. And therein lies the rub. It's not easy to get a court to find an answer to that question. It seems simple. In the eyes of the law, it could become very complicated, especially in the district.
And clearly, those protections are pretty serious. If someone has established tenancy, property owners can't change the locks, shut off the water, electricity, or heat, remove the person's belongings, or even block them from entering. So if you do any of those things, you're committing what's called an illegal eviction. And then you could actually face fines or criminal charges. So essentially, it's a civil matter until the landlord steps in and tries to block them from entering, because then it's an illegal eviction. So for the landlord to not turn this criminal, the only legal way to remove someone who claimed tenancy is to file an eviction case in court and then wait for a judge to order them out. And in DC, that process can take months, sometimes 6 months or even longer if the person fights it or files motions to delay it. And unfortunately, you have people who are professional at abusing laws like this and essentially steal people's homes. So once Shadia hit that 30-day mark and declared herself a tenant, Rashan's options basically evaporated. But she definitely tried to fight it. First, she served Shadia with a formal 30-day notice to vacate, which is the standard first move for any eviction process. Shadia then ignored it. Then Rashan called the police, thinking they might be able to help remove someone who was essentially occupying her property without permission. But the police told her the same thing every time she called. This was a civil dispute, not a criminal matter. And there was nothing they can essentially do, so they just directed her to handle it through the courts. And that's when Rashan filed for an eviction in the DC Superior Court. The problem was that this was happening in March, April, and May, while her court date wasn't scheduled until December 11th. Yeah, it was literally the other day. So by the time November rolled around, Rashan was pretty much desperate and financially drained. So she made Shadia an offer. She'd pay her $2,500 in cash if Shadia signed a document acknowledging that she wasn't actually a tenant and agreed to move out. Shadia then, I guess, accepted the deal and signed the paper. However, again, on November 15th, which was supposed to be her departure date, Shadia told Rashan that she changed her mind and didn't move out. So The same thing happened yet again. So according to Rashan, she said, "This no longer works for me. Do what you have to do. I'm not leaving." Which is a crazy thing to say when you're in someone else's property. But Rashan, she brought that signed document to the police, hoping that would change something. But they repeated the same thing. It's a civil matter. You need to wait for a court date. So fast forward to late November, and Rashan started getting calls from her neighbors. They told her they saw Shadia and other people staying at the house pack up their bags, load everything into a car, and drive away. At first, neighbors were pretty confident that it looked like Shadia was finally gone for good. So Rashan immediately contacted the Metropolitan Police Department, and they told her that she was free to secure the property however she wanted. Acting on that, she disabled all the locks so Shadia's keys wouldn't work anymore, hired a contractor to board up the windows, and because there had been electrical problems, shut off the power to the house. From her perspective, this whole mess was finally over after 9 months of fighting. But then, not too long later, her neighbors called again, and they said, by the way, Shadia is back and she's breaking back into your house. Okay. I'm picturing this like Rashan is playing Call of Duty Zombies and she's like holding X to board up her door, and Shadia is on the outside just breaking apart the boards trying to get back into the house that she stole. Yeah, definitely not an ideal situation, but it's about to get worse, like basically everything else we covered, because police arrived this time and something different happened. Because according to Rashan, the police allowed Shadia to hire a locksmith right there on the spot and get right back into the property. She finally had her property back, and Shadia pulled back up and she's like, "No, wait a minute. I live there." This is one crazy confidence game because she has no documents that prove that she lives there. But hey, the locksmith showed back up and Shadia got back inside, and Rashan was essentially back to square one. But the next day, Child Protective Services showed up to the property, and that's interesting. But the reason was that Shadia had brought her young daughter into the house, but there was no electricity running because Rashan had shut it off when she thought the other woman had abandoned the property. So as a result, CPS got involved since a child was now living in a home without electricity. Also, side note, the fact that Shadia is doing this with a child makes things so much worse. But that same day, Rashan discovered that her work truck that she had parked behind the property had gone missing. So she then filed a police report, and according to her account, Shadia had attempted to have the vehicle towed by telling the tow company that she owned the house. Again, diabolical confidence game. She has nothing to prove that she owns this property or should even be there. But still, like, this is so sad and depressing, and like the financial strain for Rashan to upkeep this property while someone's literally squatting inside of it is awful, because most likely she has to pay a mortgage on it. She definitely has to pay property taxes, which are not cheap in Washington, D.C. And I can only assume that she would have to pay all the utilities as well. So it's safe to say you are incredibly unlucky if you have to deal with a Shadia. Also, I'm like halfway through the video and I'm honestly not sure how you pronounce Shadia. If I've been saying her name wrong the entire video, honestly she deserves it, but my bad for all the other Shadias out there. Shadia. Shidija? Is that right? But it's a S-H-A. This is kind of like that one video I covered recently where it's like, I said Bexar County, but it's Bear County because the X is silent. Honestly, my own name is also kind of like that. My name's Arling, but it's spelt with an E because it's Erling in Norwegian, but like in English, Arling is closer to Erling than what Erling would be. So, Arling. Okay.
Shadija.
Nah, I'm just doubling down on Shadia. Shadia is just I don't know. This might be a Shadia. Who knows? So all of these events then triggered an emergency court hearing that took place virtually pretty much immediately. And during the hearing, a bunch of additional allegations surfaced about what had been going on over the previous months. According to the testimony in court, Shadia had allegedly tried to physically push Rashan off a ladder at one point when Rashan was putting up a sign on the exterior of the house. The sign was apparently to advertise that someone was living there against the homeowner's will. But apparently Shadia and the people that was living in there with her, they hung a sheet over that sign to like cover that up. And there was also claims that Shadia had transferred the utility accounts out of Rashan's name and put them in her daughter's name instead. But the judge ruling at the end of the hearing, however, was that Rashan needed to turn the electricity back on immediately, despite everything that had happened. Meanwhile, the actual decision about who was allowed to stay in the house, that got pushed for the following week. So now, up until this point, everything that's been said reflects Rashan's side of the story. But when reporters finally interviewed Shadia, she had a whole different story to tell. So in her story of the event, Shadia claimed that she and Rashan had verbally agreed to extend the arrangement beyond the original 32-day stay. And what began as an Airbnb booking had effectively turned into a month-to-month rental. And she claims that she continued making regular monthly payments to Rashan for several months after the original booking ended, although she acknowledged that some of those payments ran into issues and didn't always go through. So according to Shadia, she ultimately stopped paying after losing $17,000, which was apparently a result of a series of financial emergencies, or something like that.
She sent me monthly invoices, which I paid those monthly invoices in order to stay in the unit. I had a month where I had a financial loss of over like $17,000.
Was that due to work or personal?
It's a personal issue. I helped someone in the past and it came back to bite me because everyone can see, you can search me because I'm not hiding from anyone.
But of course, she had nothing to prove her statements. And as the media continued digging into that story, additional context emerged that made the situation even more complicated, to put it lightly. Because remember how Shadia originally told Rashan that she needed a rental because her apartment had been damaged by fire? Well, that was a lie, because court records show that that story was not true. And according to documents obtained by the media, Shadia was already being evicted from her previous residence when she booked Rashan's property.
When you made the Airbnb reservation, because I saw the reservation, you mentioned it was for a fire. Around that same time, court records show at your previous apartment, you were also getting evicted for not paying rent.
So that wasn't for that place, it was for a previous place where something happened during COVID when everyone was not receiving payment. I'm an entrepreneur and I also have a nonprofit. So that's what that was for. The fire that I actually had a fire. There's a police report, a fire report for it. Police came out, the fire department came out and determined that it was an electrical issue in the wall that then created.
Was it at the same apartment building?
For
Ava Noma, that apartment, because that says 2023. It was you were there 2023, 2024.
So Ava Noma is where I had the fire, yes.
Ava Noma is the one showing that you were in the process of being evicted for paying 1 month's rent when you were there for 13.
So no, that would not be accurate.
So the court records are not accurate?
I did not go to court for eviction for Ava Noma.
So she went from one landlord squatting in her house, allegedly, to a new one, and then just rinsed and repeated. There was no fire. She never had her own property. She is just allegedly professionally abusing the laws and stealing homes. Because the records indicated that she owed close to $50,000 in unpaid rent from the previous address, having paid only 1 month's worth of rent over an entire year of living there, which is just insane. That probably doesn't even cover the annual property taxes. Meanwhile, throughout this entire ordeal, Shadia's social media showed her traveling to Jamaica, going to various events, and actively promoting her nonprofit organization. And what is that? Well, for context, she runs a clothing brand called Love with Deja, which has the slogan of encouraging people to do things with love. And allegedly, she donates part of the proceeds to charity. So I guess as long as you steal people's homes with love, it's aligned with her brand. But either way, finally, on December 11th, almost 10 months after this whole thing started, Rashan got her day in court. And during the hearing, things got pretty interesting because Shadia was placed under oath and warned about what happens if you lie under oath. Basically, you can be charged with perjury, which is a felony in most states and definitely in Washington, D.C., which is kind of important because of what comes next. Because remember how Shadia had told reporters that she'd never been evicted before? Well, that wasn't true because she was confronted with her past eviction records in court and her story suddenly changed. She said that she didn't recall whether she'd been evicted or not. And then she argued that the whole thing wasn't even relevant to the case. Man, that's absolutely relevant to the case. It shows that you've done this tomfoolery before. Also, what a pathetic way to deflect. Either way, the homeowner also took to the stand during the hearing, and after listening to both sides, the judge made a pretty clear ruling. Shadia Romero did not have the tenancy rights to the property, and the judge specifically pointed to that agreement that Roshan had gotten her to sign back in November. You know, the one where Shadia acknowledged that she wasn't the tenant and agreed to leave in exchange for $2,500. The court also found that document was still valid and binding, and because Shadia had no legal tenant status, the judge authorized Roshan to have her removed from the property immediately, that very same day. So finally, after like 10 months, a massive W to the homeowner. Because just imagine a year of legal proceedings, mortgage payments, utility bills, and a heavy load of stress, not knowing when you'll finally get your property back. That's a nightmare. But thankfully, the woman was officially evicted from the house, and the reporters explained the whole thing here.
That's right, and this is actually one of the first times the homeowners have been back to the home in a couple of months. And as you mentioned, the judge ordered that the alleged squatter is not a tenant, therefore she has no tenant rights, and the homeowners were allowed to get her out of the home and evict her immediately, and that is what you are seeing. We have community members that actually came here to support the homeowners and help clear out the home after watching the reports and hearing what the homeowners were dealing with. And even inside the home, you can see some of the area that they have started clearing as well. The homeowner mentioned to me that she has been in shock and everything that was with everything that was inside of this home, as well as some of the damage that she found as well.
And with that, she could also remove the infamous sheet that was hanging outside of her house, the one Shadia had hung to block Roshan's message to the neighbors. That was also removed. And for the first time in months, Roshan was finally able to walk back into her own property without dealing with locked doors or authorities telling her she couldn't enter her own property. It's just so insane. So now, after all this played out on the media, Airbnb itself decided to make a statement, and the company confirmed that they've been tracking the story through news reports, and they made it pretty clear where they stood throughout the whole situation. According to a spokesperson, all the protections Airbnb offers, which is their air cover 24/7 support, all of that only applies when everything stays on their platform. Hosts and guests should always communicate, book, and pay on Airbnb, so they're covered by our policies and protections. We display warnings across the site to stay on Airbnb, and we provide information on why this is important. It helps ensure that both parties are protected by our policies, terms of service, and safeguards like air cover for hosts. These protections are forfeited if users book and pay outside of Airbnb, which I guess means as soon as Shadia's original 32-day booking ended and she started claiming tenant rights, that moved the whole thing off of Airbnb's system, even though there was no business dealings outside of the app. But I guess at that point, Airbnb legally couldn't help her. This whole situation just sucks for the homeowner. But there was thankfully one action that Airbnb did take. They permanently removed Shadia from the platform. And the media coverage of this case got so widespread that DC officials had to start addressing it publicly. And it seems like there are even conversations happening now about potentially changing DC's tenant protection laws to prevent this exact scenario from happening to other homeowners. Because currently, the way the law is written, all it takes is 30 days and some cash changing hands for someone to claim tenant rights, and suddenly they can be locked in your house without paying anything for 10 months apparently. Because while pro-tenant laws serve a real purpose, again, they can easily be exploited by people who do this stuff professionally. And based on Shadia's history of evictions and unpaid rent across multiple properties, it's safe to say that she understood the system pretty well. And one can only hope that she doesn't go and find a new victim. But, you know, considering her track record, I wouldn't keep my hopes up too high, because I don't think she'll receive any real punishment for this unless the landlord sues. But the problem with that is the landlord has been tied up in court for 10 months, so it's not like the landlord is going to want to jump right back into court. One would think, at least. It's just a nightmare. This is literally a nightmare scenario. So I think it's just like really important to get the word out. If this person is trying to rent from you, be very cautious. Tread carefully. But hey, other than that, feel free to subscribe if you're new here, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.